Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. I'm playing catch up a little bit on book reviews, so I'm going back to some books that we finished a couple weeks ago, but want to talk about a book that I recently finished reading with my girls, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis. Those of you who are subscribed to this channel will know that we've been reading through the Chronicles of Narnia, just one after the other, and just finished reading this, like I said, a couple weeks ago. We're now about 50 pages into the next book, but wanted to give you my thoughts on this wonderful, wonderful volume. So anyone who has read the Narnia series will know this book well. It's often, when people are kind of trying to pick their top, one or two or three, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is one of those titles that often gets placed in one of those slots. It's just very well beloved, very much enjoyed, which is interesting because it's one of the Narnia tales that doesn't actually take place in Narnia at all. The characters don't end up in Narnia because the story is really the voyage that they're taking from Narnia to explore the oceans, but specifically to fulfill a quest. So this picks up right after Prince Caspian and is very much connected to it. So, spoiler alerts for anyone who wants to experience the plot on their own, but I'll just kind of go through, what happens. So the story begins with Edmund and Lucy. The kind of setting is that, Peter and Susan are off with their parents, and so Edmund and Lucy, being the younger siblings, right, as younger siblings often are kind of shipped off somewhere else, and they have to go stay with their aunt and uncle and their cousin, Eustace Clarence Scrubb. And Eustace is quite a annoying, difficult person, right, as some cousins can be, right? We've all experienced this, or perhaps we were that annoying cousin, who knows? But they're in this house, and Eustace is just picking on them, especially Lucy, and he has kind of found out about, he's overheard them talking about Narnia, and he sees this as kind of a silly, childish game, and so he's always giving them a hard time and trying to torment them in different ways. Well, long story short, all three of them end up getting pulled into Narnia in a sense, although again, it's not taking place in the land of Narnia, but rather on the sea. And they're rescued by this ship, the Dawn Treader, which is captained by none other than Prince Caspian. A couple years after the events of Prince Caspian itself. But basically, Caspian has come to the throne. Peace is in the land. He's kind of secured his kingdom. And now what he's doing is trying to fulfill a vow that he made, a quest that he undertook to try and find, if he can, the Narnian lords, the 7 Narnian lords who supported his father, who were driven out by Miraz, and to either bring them back to Narnia or find out what happened to them or avenge them if they have died in some way. So Lewis, as a good medievalist, right, that's his academic background and training, is giving us this great quest story, and it's a wonderful setting. And so the story unfolds as they're voyaging through the seas, visiting these different islands, dealing with different problems and challenges that emerge. And in the course of that, we get some of the most wonderful scenes and characters that we find anywhere in the Narnia series. My girls really loved the Duffleput Island, as I think many kids do, and all the scenes that unfold there. At the end, they reach Ramondu's Island, which is just this very gripping scene and experience. And one of my favorite kind of scenes in the book is when they land on, I think what they end up calling Dragon Island, because they find there a dragon that has died, and it's actually one of the Narnian lords who was turned into a dragon and had passed away. But on that island, Eustace becomes a dragon, and Lewis uses this whole encounter and scene to really be Eustace's conversion. And that brings me to kind of just what I love so much about this book. There's kind of 3 things that stand out to me about this book. The first is the character of Eustace. Lewis begins with this wonderful, wonderful line that I think is one of the best openings in any children's book ever. This is the first, sentences of chapter 1. There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. His parents called him Eustace Clarence, and his schoolmasters called him Scrubb. I can't tell you how his friends spoke to him, for he had none. He didn't call his father and mother, but Harold and Alberta. They were very up-to-date and advanced people. They were vegetarians, non-smokers, and teetotalers, and wore a special kind of underclothes. In their house there was very little furniture and very few clothes on the beds, and the windows were always open. Eustace Clarence liked animals, especially beetles, if they were dead and pinned on a card. He liked books if they were books of information, and had pictures of grain elevators or of fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools. And it goes on from there. But just the way that Lewis introduces Eustace tells you everything you need to know about him. And he's so different than the Pevensies. And that's one of the things that Lewis draws out throughout the book, is that Eustace has not read the right kinds of books. He hasn't heard the right kinds of stories. He doesn't know what to expect from a quest or dragons or knights or any of this. His imagination is just kind of deadened and dulled, and his character is twisted and corrupted. In many ways, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader is Eustace's story. It begins with him, and then we have these moments where, Eustace is kind of keeping this diary, which really what he's doing is he's crafting his own narrative about the story that's very different than reality, but it's all about how he's been mistreated, how everyone else is foolish, and he's the only one who understands. Lewis is kind of bringing us into our own sinful thought patterns, really, in the character of Eustace, to see how so often we can do this with adventures that God brings us on. We turn them into pity parties and opportunities to justify ourselves, to vindicate ourselves, to villainize others, and that's really what Eustace is doing. And he's just so wrapped up in self that he's dead to the world around him. He's dead to morality or virtue or honor or adventure or any of these things. And he's a character that you can't help feeling pity for. And it's really when he's given over to those things. On Dragon Island, what happens is he encounters this treasure and he begins to be filled with all these kind of greedy dragonish thoughts, and he is transformed into a dragon, right? Which I think is Lewis's way of showing what Paul talks about in Romans 1, being given over to our sin, right? That's the consequence of it, is you become exactly what you want to become, in a sense. But when Eustace becomes this greedy dragon who's powerful and all of these things, he realizes how empty it is. He realizes how cut off he is, which he's actually been cut off. He's been a dragon, in a sense, all throughout the book, but he hasn't recognized it till this moment. And there's this great encounter where Eustace begins to be drawn out of himself, and then he has this encounter with Aslan for the first time. And he has to go into these waters to be cleansed, which again, I think Lewis is drawing on that baptismal imagery and all of that in that scene as well. And Eustace is told by Aslan that he can't bathe until he has undressed. He has to come naked, right? He can't bring anything to the table. And so Eustace tries to undress himself, to pull off his dragon skin, right? Because he realizes that dragons are kind of like snakes and they can shed their skin. So he tries to shed his skin, but it's not enough, right? There's still something that remains. And again, Lewis is just so beautifully picturing the fact that in salvation, it's God who saves. We can't do it or get ourselves ready for it. God is the one who has to do it. And that's what happens. Aslan comes with his claws and removes Eustace's skin and then bathes him in the water, and then he is reborn as a man once again. He's no longer living as an animal, right, suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, but has become fully human. And from that point on, and I love the way that Lewis does this too, Eustace is not totally transformed in the sense that he's always kind and nice, and no, like sometimes he's still annoying or a know-it-all or whatever, but he begins to become a better person, as Lewis puts it, and just beautifully captures conversion and that whole process. And so I love the Voyage of the Dawn Treader for that whole story arc and scene in itself. A second thing I love about it is the character of Reepicheep. So Reepicheep was introduced in Prince Caspian, and he's a gripping character from the very first moments that he kind of walks onto the page. But we see him mature and develop in some amazing ways in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And in a sense, reading through this again with my girls, I was just struck that there's a sense in which Reepicheep is almost kind of an Apostle Peter kind of character. When we first meet him in Prince Caspian, he is dynamic. He's the leader of the mice, But he gets a little bit of a gentle rebuke at the end of Prince Caspian for his pride and kind of his folly and vanity and some of those things that he's prone to. And in many ways, Lewis picks this mouse to be almost the paradigmatic knight character. He's always looking for quest. He's always concerned about his honor. He's always looking for adventure. He's fearless and whatever. And yet, what we see in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader is all of those characters on display, but they're being sanctified almost. And by the end, Reepicheep is the only one who's able to go into Aslan's country without passing through death. So, of course, there's some allusions there to Enoch in the Old Testament and Elijah and so forth. But I think there's a kind of Apostle Peter arc for me too, that when you get to Peter's epistles, he's this mature, godly man. But we know his story, that he didn't always start that way, that there were these character traits that had to be sanctified, rough edges rubbed off, and him prepared to really be the vessel that God had wanted him to be. And I think Reepicheep captures some of those things. He's also just a fun and great character and a wonderful picture for little kids, especially, although for all of us, of what it means to be brave, what it means to be courageous, because he's the smallest, he's the weakest. If you look at it, he's what we often feel ourselves to be, kind of mice. And yet what we find is he is kind of the boldest and bravest on this voyage that we have. So Eustace is a great character, Reepicheep is a great character, and then the last thing I love about the Voyage of the Dawn Treader is the kind of echoes of eternity that we get. So the end of the voyage, again, spoiler alerts, the end of the voyage, they get to Ramondu's Island, and they're trying to sail to the end of the world. And Lewis kind of talks about this, that our world is this sphere, but Narnia is not. Narnia is a flat world, and so you can actually reach the edge, and that's what they're trying to do. And at the edge and beyond the edge is Aslan's country. And so from the moment you hit Ramondu's Island, you are on the doorstep of eternity, which I think is interesting because, again, we had the baptismal imagery with Eustace and becoming, de-dragonized. On Ramondu's Island, it centers around this table that is feasted on and renewed every day, every morning. That's the beginning of the end. That's the doorstep of eternity. It's communion. It's the Lord's Supper. You're not in Aslan's country, but you're at the doorstep and you're looking forward to it. You're getting that taste of it, which I just think is wonderful how Lewis brings these kind of sacramental imagery together. And so that final voyage has a very different tone. It's not the kind of questing adventure tone. It has this kind of, it feels like Pilgrim's Progress as you're reaching the end, as you're crossing over. And Lewis draws that out beautifully. And in the final scenes, the last two chapters, or the last three chapters, are the beginning of the end of the world, the wonders of the last sea, and then the very end of the world. And I think that word end is being used kind of, there's a bit of a pun or play on words going on there, because it's not only the end in the sense that it's the limit or the finish, but it's the end in that it's the destination. All of Narnian life, all of life in this world is spilling over to Aslan's country. That's where the current is headed. That's where it's taking you. It's a very Christian view. It's not a cyclical thing. It's a linear thing. It's bringing us to Aslan's country. And so there's just some wonderful things that Lewis, I think, is doing there beneath the surface. And the final scenes where Reepicheep enters into Aslan's country, and where Edmund and Lucy and Eustace, encounter Aslan as the lamb who becomes the lion in this wonderful scene at the end, is just so gripping. And you can understand why, when Lewis was writing this, he thought for a while that this might be the last Narnian story, and it makes a lot of sense. It pulls together so many things. It kind of picks up where Prince Caspian left off and brings it to a close, and it brings us right to the edge of Aslan's country. And there's these very important ending, right? The final scenes, the final page of the book, where Edmund and Lucy are told by Aslan that they won't be able to return anymore, right? Again, you can kind of see how Lewis is thinking maybe this is the end. And they begin to weep. And Lucy says, "It isn't Narnia, it's you. We shan't We shan't meet you there in their own world. And how can we live never meeting you? And Aslan says, but you shall meet me, dear one. And Edmund says, are you there too, sir? I am, said Aslan, but there I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name. This was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there. Which, of course, is Lewis's kind of helping his readers, and I just love this, begin to realize that what he's doing in these books is not just telling them a good story. It's not just an adventure or a quest. It's meant to introduce them to someone, something greater, to Jesus Christ, to God as he truly is. And that Aslan is meant to just point them to the real substance. This is the shadow. Christ is the substance. And that's what Lewis is doing. So I'm very glad that Lewis did not stop here, because some of the books coming up are among my favorites. But I would definitely put Voyage of the Dawn Treader in my top 3 of the Chronicles of Narnia. And it repays a rereading at every opportunity that you have. So if you haven't read this, I would really encourage you to pick it up. If you have read it, reread it. You'll see new things. You'll be reminded of old wonderful things, and find a lot to enjoy in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis.